Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 is perhaps the best known of all symphonies. In this symphony, a previously unknown energy and passion is released. Beethoven also utilizes instruments that are not part of the standard orchestra, such as the piccolo, contrabassoon, and trombones, in order to amplify the intensity of the orchestra. There are 4 movements. The first movement is in sonata allegro form, with the tempo marking of allegro con brio, which means lively with vigor. The movement arises from the rhythmic idea of 3 shorts and a long, SSSL, which proceeds to dominate the entire symphony. Beethoven described the motive as "Fate knocks at the door." The second movement is in theme and variations form. It is of a serene character with an exploration of 2 themes, varied through changes in melodic outline, harmony, rhythm, tempo, dynamics, register, key, mode, and timbre. In the second theme, the 4-note motive is utilized, which provides unity to the symphony. The third movement is the scherzo, which opens with a rocket theme introduced by the low strings. The trio is of a humorous nature in C major, and the scherzo returns in a modified version followed by a transitional passage to the final movement. In this transitional passage, the timpani sounds the memorable 4-note motive. The fourth movement begins without a pause. The rhythmic motive returns, making this an early example of cyclical form, in which a theme or musical idea from one movement returns to a later movement. Follow the detailed listening guide to all 4 movements of this monumental work in your text. The symphony was composed from 1807 to 1808. In the first movement, Allegro con brio, listen for the 4-note motive, which is the basis for the thematic development, and a contrasting lyrical second theme. The 4-note rhythmic idea shapes the entire work. The key is in C minor, though it shifts dramatically from minor to major tonality. The texture of this movement is mostly homophonic, and it is in a concise sonata allegro form with an extended coda. In the development section, repetition, sequence, and variation techniques are used. The second movement has a tempo marking of andante con moto. It is in theme and variations form with 2 contrasting themes. The first theme is smooth, the second is built on the 4-note motive. The meter is a flowing triple meter, and the key is a contrasting key of A-flat major. The texture of this movement is also mostly homophonic. The orchestra sections are featured in groups, strings, woodwinds, and brass. The third movement has a tempo marking of allegro. It is in a scherzo form. Listen for a melody with a wide range, the ascending scherzo theme, and the more conjunct and quick trio theme. The rhythm prominently features the 4-note motive, and the meter is a quick triple meter throughout. The scherzo section is the key of C minor shifting to C major for the trio, followed by the return of the scherzo. The texture is primarily homophonic, though there is a polyphonic fugue-like treatment in the trio. The form is A, B, A, scherzo, trio, scherzo, followed by an added link to the final movement. Musical expression is accomplished through a wide range of dynamics and fast tempo. This movement features the low strings and the use of pizzicato at the return of the scherzo. A timpani is used in the transition to the last movement. The fourth movement has a tempo marking of allegro. It begins without a break and is in sonata allegro form with a long coda. Listen for a triumphant theme that outlines the C major triad, and an energetic second theme. The 4-note rhythmic idea continues to be featured, and the meter is a very fast duple meter. The key of the movement is C major, and remains so throughout. The texture of this movement is mostly homophonic, and the return of material from earlier movements renders it cyclical in form. Musical expression is accomplished through forceful dynamics and sudden dynamic contrast, such as the use of fortepiano effects. The mood is intense and spirited. Additional instruments are added to the conventional orchestra for this movement, which are the piccolo, contrabassoon, and trombones. In the classical era, most concertos were written for solo instrument and orchestra. The three movements of a classical concerto follow the fast, slow, fast pattern established in the Baroque era. A unique feature of a solo concerto is the cadenza, which is a brilliant solo passage in the manner of improvisation that interrupts the movement toward the end. The orchestra is silent as the soloist launches into a display of virtuosity often centered on one or more themes of the movements, thus creating a dramatic effect. The first movement of a concerto is in sonata allegro form with a double exposition. In a double exposition, there is an initial exposition for the orchestra, known as the orchestral exposition, followed by a second exposition for the solo instrument with the orchestra. In the second exposition, the soloist often plays elaborated versions of the themes first heard in the orchestra during the first exposition, and sometimes has new material as well. The development section offers opportunity for virtuosic display, often in dialogue with the orchestra. In the recapitulation, as is customary in sonata allegro form, the themes are brought back to the tonic key by the soloist and the orchestra. The cadenza, if there is one, will appear at the end of the movement, followed by a coda that brings the movement to a close. The second movement of a concerto is generally slow and lyrical, often with a tempo marking of andante, adagio, or largo. This movement is often in a key that is related to the home key, such as the dominant or relative major, or minor or subdominant. The third movement is the finale in a concerto. The tempo marking is often one that is lightning fast, such as allegro molto or presto. It is shorter than the first movement and is often in rondo form, which could be modified to include a development section, as found in sonata allegro form. The third movement may also have its own cadenza, which calls again for brilliance in virtuoso playing and brings the piece to an exciting end. Mozart played an important role in the development of the piano concerto. He wrote 27 in all, mostly as display pieces for his own public performances, because they are ablaze with brilliant flourishes and elegant gestures which are characteristic of 18th century music. In 1784 he composed the piano concerto in G major, K453, for his student, Barbara von Pleuer. This concerto displays the form characteristic of this genre very clearly. It was considered proper for noble and upper middle-class women to study music. Many became highly skilled amateurs. Some were able to make a living as music teachers or professional performers. Three women in particular stand out as performers in this era. Maria Anna Mozart, Nanner, Mozart's sister, who toured extensively with her brother in her childhood, performing concertos and four-hand piano works. When she retired from performing to raise a family, Mozart wrote several works for her and would send his piano cadenzas for her to try out. Maria Theresa von Paradis, blind pianist and organist, was a friend of Mozart. She retained in her memory at least 60 different concertos that she prepared for an extended European tour. She was also a composer, but many of her works have been lost. Barbara Pleuer, student of Mozart, for whom Mozart wrote 2 concertos, including the G major work, Mozart was so proud of her that he invited the composer Giovanni Passeo to the premiere of the concerto. He wrote to his father, "I am fetching Passeo in my carriage, as I want him to hear both my pupil and my compositions." The first movement of Mozart's piano concerto in G major has a tempo marking of allegro, and is in concerto form with 2 expositions, followed by a development section, recapitulation, and coda. Listen for a lilting first theme, a quiet and lyrical second theme, and a new graceful piano theme that appears in the second exposition. The piece also features very decorative piano writing. The tempo is lively with a march-like rhythm. The key is G major, though it shifts to the dominant key of D major in the piano exposition. The texture is mostly homophonic. The elegant and graceful mood is mainly accomplished through the use of decorative turns. The score is for piano and orchestra, which contains pairs of woodwinds, horns, and the usual complement of string instruments. A sonata is an instrumental work for one or two instruments consisting of 3 or 4 contrasting movements. The movements follow the pattern of the multi-movement cycle as described previously for the string quartet, symphony, and concerto. In the classical era, the sonata for piano solo or 2 instruments became an important genre for amateurs in the home and for composers like Mozart and Beethoven to perform at concerts. Beethoven wrote 32 piano sonatas, which span his entire range of compositional output. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata was composed in his formative years, 1801, but possesses the emotional expressiveness of the Romantic era. The title was given after Beethoven's death by the poet Ludwig Rellstab, who compared the piece to the moonlit scenery along Lake Lucerne in Switzerland. Beethoven composed it during his first style period and dedicated it to his pupil, Countess Giulietta Guicciardi. She was originally thought to be the woman whom Beethoven addressed as his immortal beloved. The Moonlight Sonata, which Beethoven called Sonata quasi una fantasia, Fantasy Sonata, breaks with formal modes in that it starts with a slow movement. The tempo marking of the first movement is Adagio sostenuto. The key is C-sharp minor. The second movement is a scherzo and trio in a major key, which provides relief from the emotionally charged opening and the stormy finale to follow. The closing movement of this work is in sonata allegro form, and the mood could best be described as stormy. Beethoven, ironically, was not as impressed with this sonata, although it enjoyed immediate success and remains one of the most beloved works in the repertoire today. He said, "Surely I have written better things." The first movement has elements of a development section and recapitulation, but does not present the opposing themes or keys which are typical of sonata allegro form. Thus, it is more easily categorized as a precursor to the modified strophic song forms of the Romantic composers. In this first movement, listen for a delicate singing melody which moves slowly and is heard in various ranges. Then, short melodic ideas are passed between the right and left hands. There is a continuous triplet pattern in the accompaniment. The key is C minor with some modulations. The texture is homophonic with an active accompaniment, then contrapuntal. The form is modified song form, which would be strophic with 2 strophes separated by a development section. The mood is ethereal, which is accomplished primarily through the use of soft dynamics. The classical era choral music was an offshoot of the Baroque tradition. Among the principal genres were the Mass, the Requiem Mass, and the Oratorio. A Mass is a musical setting of the most solemn service of the Roman Catholic Church. A Requiem is a musical setting of the Mass for the dead. And an Oratorio, as previously studied, is usually focused on a biblical story. Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven all made significant contributions to the sacred repertory. Mozart's last composition was a Requiem Mass. The Oratorio was made popular by Handel in works such as Messiah. Haydn's 2 oratorios, The Creation and The Seasons, are widely popular at the time and are often performed today. By the classical era, opera had become a branch of musical entertainment that reached the widest public. The opera houses were now the centers of experimentation. The prevalent form of opera was opera seria, serious or tragic Italian opera. Eventually, there was a desire for more naturalness in opera, and for it to reflect the simplicity of day-to-day life. This desire had its fulfillment in every country of Europe. The names for this type of opera were in England, ballad or dialogue opera, in Germany, Singspiel, in France, opera comique, and in Italy, opera buffa. The buffo was a traditional character who spoke to the audience in a bass voice with a wink and a nod. This is in stark contrast to the type of sound of the artificial soprano, the castrato. Don Giovanni combines the elements of opera buffa with that of opera seria. The opera is set to a libretto by Lorenzo da Ponte, who had collaborated with Mozart on a number of occasions with great success. Don Giovanni recounts the story of Don Juan, an aristocratic, amoral womanizer who seduced and abandoned women across Europe. In the end, he is doomed to hell by the ghost of a man whom he has murdered. In Act I, the servant, Leporello, who is the buffo or comic character in the opera, is keeping watch outside of the home of Donna Anna, while his master is inside trying to seduce her. She chases him out of the house and runs after him, determined to find his identity. She calls for help, and her father rushes in to aid her, but is killed by a duel with Don Giovanni. Donna Anna has her fiancé swear to avenge her father's death. Your section begins with the next scene. Donna Elvira, another woman, is in a rage over a man who has abandoned her, also Don Giovanni. She sings the aria, "Ah, chi mi dici mai?" Ah, who can tell me where that cruel man is? In this aria, Donna Elvira recounts how she was spurned by the man she loved and now vows to rip his heart out. Listen for a short orchestral introduction, then a disjunct aria that outlines triads and contains many leaps, with a cadenza near the end that features a wide vocal range. It is in duple meter with two main sections, each repeated with variation, A, B, A, B. The performing forces alternate between a soprano and the orchestra, with occasional interjections from Don Giovanni and Leporello. The mood is anger, which is mostly expressed with sudden dynamic shifts, a quicker tempo, and the use of extreme range changes. Don Giovanni and Leporello overhear her, and in this recitative Don Giovanni wishes to console her. But when she raises her veil, he recognizes her as she does him. In the lengthy recitative as found on your listening guide, he dodges the situation, but insists that Leporello tell her everything. He does so in the famous catalogue aria, which is the subject of the listening guide in your text. Listen for more static lines in a speech-like pattern in the melody. The rhythm consists of quick notes delivered freely. The different voices are accompanied by the continuo instruments only. In this aria, Leporello, first in a rapid speech-like patter, then in comforting lyrical tones, lists Don Giovanni's conquest for Elvira. 640 in Italy, 230 in Germany, 100 in France, 91 in Turkey, but in Spain 1003. He breaks into a lilting minuet as he describes the different types of women: blondes, brunettes, plump ones, thin ones, old ones, young ones, etc. Listen for an opening section with a fast patter quality and a syllabic text setting. The second section is more lyrical. The tempo marking is allegro in duple meter, then switches to an andante in triple meter. The aria is in a simple two-part form, allegro and andante with some repeated text to different music. The three composers just studied, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, are together referred to as the Viennese school, since the careers of all three reached their fulfillment in Vienna, known as Europe's leading musical center. All three composers had traits that foreshadowed the Romantic period. Beethoven's music pushed even closer to the Romantic era through the use of sudden dynamic contrasts, new instruments, and bold modulations. He also expanded the classical forms and dramatic intensity of his music. 19th century Vienna continued as a major arts center, attracting many of history's greatest composers. These included Johannes Brahms and Franz Schubert, who carried on the traditions of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven into the first upsurge of Romanticism.